Hey guys, I'm on the east side. I'm on Consol, just past Tony Paco's, which is right down there. And behind me is a building that most of you have probably noticed. And if you've noticed it at all, you've wondered, why is there a place named after Lou Diamond Phillips in Toledo, Ohio? Well, it's not named after Lou Diamond Phillips. It is named after Mastery Gunnery Sergeant Lou Diamond. As you've read in Toledo's War already, the Lou Diamond, after whom the actor was named, was a very real Toledoan who became a legend on the island of Guadalcanal. They called him the 200-year-old Marine, and he did nothing to dispel that myth. He wanted people to think every legend about him was true, even though he was only 50-something when he made it to Guadalcanal. He's in World War I when he's 28, 29 years old. Spends his 30s and 40s as a China Marine with the 4th Marines in Shanghai, China. And then he's back here in Toledo on December 7th. He'd come back to the east side to stay with his brother. On the 7th of December, 1941, he hears about the Pearl Harbor attack, throws on the uniform again, heads downtown, gets back on a train and gets out of here and demands to be put into the action. And old Lou Diamond ends up being part of the Marine Expeditionary Force that's going to lead the first American offensive of the war, Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal is so important because it's the first time that American forces took the fight to the enemy. It's also going to be the first American victory in the war, first land victory in the war. And in that battle, Lou Diamond, who grew up over here at Wheeling in Front, becomes a legend and becomes an inspiration for thousands of others as the ideal Marine. Nobody was going to tell a 200-year-old Marine no when it came to the Second World War. And Lou Diamond, as we said, is going to make his name at Guadalcanal. Let's understand why this place was so important. So we've got a map here of the Pacific Theater of Operations. And as you guys well know, December of 1941 is when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. But before that, and leading up to that massive offensive on the 7th of December, they had expanded to an outer rim, and that rim kept expanding. And by the time we get to April of 1942, Japan controls, as you can see here, easily a third of the Pacific Ocean. They've got the Marshall Islands, the Gilbert Islands, parts of the Solomon Islands. They've gone around New Guinea, which Australia is trying to defend at that point. They've got all of what is today Indonesia, Cambodia, Vietnam. They control parts of China. They've taken the Philippines by this point. And the next part of the plan is pushing that rim out. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who is a brilliant, brilliant man, wants to have a defense line that goes right down the middle of the Pacific and takes the island of Midway, which is, I believe, technically part of the Hawaiian Islands chain, going like this. He wants the island of Midway, which had an American base on it. He wants Fiji and some of the French Polynesian islands, New Caledonia, which was a French territory, the rest of the Solomons, and right up to New Zealand. What does this allow Yamamoto to do? It's almost like he's got a knife at the throat of the United States at that point. He's close enough to Hawaii that we would know we can't take a move without him coming after us. In the middle of the ocean, out here, it means there's nothing between him and something that's just off screen, the Panama Canal. And that would kind of threaten, yes, America has the canal at that point, but what does that mean if you really can't get anywhere in the Pacific because it's all cut off to you? It would have cut off Australia and New Zealand from help from the United States. So Yamamoto's plan is big and it's bold. It's going to result in 3 battles that you learned about in the reading. The Battle of Midway that you read about, where Leonard Dow, the Wake graduate, played a big role with Admiral Halsey's force. It's going to lead to the Battle of the Coral Sea, the naval battle down there. That's also going to be critically important because it's the first time 2 navies fight each other without the ships seeing each other, because it's aircraft carrier airplanes taking on each other. And then finally, it's going to lead to the Battle of Guadalcanal. And Guadalcanal is right about down here, and we'll talk more about that and look at that in a map in a second. So the Solomon Islands were under early attack by Japan. The Solomons, again, are this whole island chain right here, right off New Guinea, that provide a route to Australia. The Solomons had been under attack by the Japanese since quite early on. They had not yet been fortified, though. The Japanese hadn't had time to really dig in their positions, build defenses, install anti-aircraft guns, and those sorts of things. And the Solomons pose a deep threat to the Allies. With the Solomons, you can cut off access to Australia, cut off access to New Zealand, and cut off access to New Guinea and the rest of Asia. It allowed Japan to cover the sea lanes of the South Pacific. There's no way, if you control the Solomons and you control that passage between New Zealand and Australia, there's no way to get to Asia other than going down into the Southern Ocean, some of the worst waters in the world, roughest waters in the world, that is, to get over there. So they really can't control the South Pacific this way. And finally, as I've said a million times here, they could control access to the east coast of Australia. So if we look at the Google Maps of that real quickly, here's the Google Maps of the Solomon Islands, specifically looking at Guadalcanal at the center. So we see the coast of Australia right here. New Caledonia is down here. New Zealand is going to be right over here. If I'm patient enough to wait for it to load. Yeah, here's New Zealand right down here. So in the Solomons, the Japanese already control the northern Solomon Islands, Bougainville, which is going to end up being a really important island for a bunch of Toledoans. And the island they're trying to get next as they move on their way down is this island called Guadalcanal. And what I want you to see on Guadalcanal are a few different things here as we look at this. First of all, Guadalcanal is a big island compared to its neighbors. It is not a big island compared to anything else. It's about the size of Long Island in New York City. Just to the north of it is something called Iron Bottom Sound. And we're going to learn about why that's called Iron Bottom Sound because there's a lot of iron at the bottom of it. And the iron that is at the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound is going to be a lot of American ships and a lot of Japanese ships from the Battle of Savo Island, which is right here as you read about the Battle of Savo Island. The other place that I want you thinking about right away is this very small island called Tulagi. Tulagi is going to be one of the first places taken by American Marines in this invasion. They believed it was critical to take Tulagi, where the Japanese had a seaplane base, before you landed people over here around Lunga Point, where they're going to build the airstrip, improve the Japanese airstrip, and rename it Henderson Field. So the American plan, again, zooming out, we're going to take a little bitty island off of this little island so we can attack this island, okay? That's kind of the plan. Hopefully that made at least marginally a little sense to you. So, in the big picture, Admiral King, Ernest King, is the Chief of Naval Operations at this point. If I'm correct, he's from Lorain, Ohio, over by Cleveland, I think, but I can't swear to that. Admiral King says we have to attack the island of Guadalcanal before the Japanese can fortify it. Because if the Japanese have time to pour concrete, build defenses, bring in shore guns, anti-aircraft guns, it's going to be almost impossible to take the island, and then almost impossible to use Australia as a base and help supply the Australians. He says the consequences would be horrible. The consequences would not just be not getting that island. It would be possibly Australia having to negotiate a peace. It would be the Japanese being able to push onto the Panama Canal. These are real consequences. The problem, however, that Admiral King runs into is that President Roosevelt had promised the British that America's strategy was going to be Germany first. Even though it was the Japanese who attacked the United States to get into the war, Roosevelt and Churchill agree you've got to beat Germany first and then turn your full attention to Japan. So in the very early years of the war in the Pacific is kind of an afterthought. Almost all of our resources, all of our supplies, most of our army forces are going to be sent over to the European theater, and the Pacific theater is going to kind of get what's left over, plus a bunch of Marines and Navy, since it's an ocean battle. General Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, General Marshall refuses to use the Army. He says, I'm not going to use the Army on this Guadalcanal operation. Admiral King says, that's not a problem. I'm the Chief of Naval Operations. You know who the Marines work for? Me. Give me ships. Give me Marines. I'll do this Guadalcanal thing on myself. The plan that they come up with is called Operation Watchtower. Japan had been building an airfield on Guadalcanal near that place called Lunga Point that I showed you in the map. As planning ramps up, the island of Guadalcanal becomes the #1 target for the Americans in the Pacific. Admiral Nimitz, one of the great fleet admirals out in the Pacific, activates the 1st Marine Division, which our boy Lou Diamond is part of. He's got 75 attack and transport ships to carry out this mission. Most of the soldiers he has with him have little training, and I call them soldiers, but of course what I mean is Marines. Most of them had little training. Most of them are carrying the 1903 rifle. Now, I don't want this to become a weapons class because I think weapons classes get boring quick, okay? But the M1903 rifle is what's called a bolt-action rifle. Some of you know what this is, some of you don't. But this is basically the rifle that is pew, click, click, pew, click, click, pew, okay? If that makes any sense. The rifle that most soldiers are being armed with, and Marines are going to be armed with after this, is called the M1 Garand. And the M1 Garand is a semi-automatic. You've got a clip of bullets you put into it, and it was an interior clip. It didn't look like the clips that like AK-47s and kind of these nonsense guns that a lot of people use are. It had a clip of bullets that went into the body of the rifle, and the M1 Garand was pew, pew, pew. As quick as you can pull the trigger is as quick as you can shoot with an M1 Garand. As opposed to the 1903, again, which is pew, click, click, pew, click, click. The Japanese are coming in with semi-automatic rifles, and semi-automatic rifles are as fast as you can pull the trigger. The Marines don't have that. The Marines have these 1903s, which are 40-year-old rifles at this point. They have 10 days worth of ammunition, about a week's worth of supplies and food. They get out there. Diamond is part of this Raider detachment, along with, this is a friend of mine's grandfather, and I can't think of his name right now, and I'm really embarrassed by it. The other guy from the east side, the guy from Woodville Road, but he was much younger than Lou Diamond, and his name will come to me in a little bit. But there's these 2 Toledo guys that are part of Merrill's Marauders, the Raiders, Marine Raiders that are going to land on Tulagi. They're going to take out the seaplane base. You read about Lou Diamond firing that mortar that lands on a Japanese submarine, forces it to go under, and they're watching a battle. In the book, Rosenhaus talks about how in this battle, Diamond and these guys are watching the Battle of Savo Island, that naval battle. They're watching it happen like they're at a theater. They're sitting on a hill watching a naval battle play out in front of them. What they don't know is what's going to happen next. As they take those islands, things are going to go really well at first. The guys on Tulagi take that island in about a day, day and a half. The guys who get onto Guadalcanal are virtually unopposed when they hit the beaches. This is not taking a beach under fire for the most part. They're able to get inland. They think it's going pretty easily. They take the airfield on the second day. The Japanese leave behind bulldozers and trucks and food and weapons, and the Americans are thinking, man, this was pretty easy. Except then the Battle of Savo Island breaks out there. The Navy loses 14 aircraft. And the admiral who was in charge of this was a guy named Frank Jack Fletcher. Fletcher is worried, okay? And this is one of those things historically where we can either, we're lucky that 80 years later we can go look back and say, dude, you were an idiot. Why would you do that? But at the time, he didn't know what we know. We didn't know how it's going to end. He didn't know how it's going to end up, and we do. Fletcher is worried. If I lost 14 planes today and I lose 20 planes tomorrow and 20 planes after that, pretty soon I don't have any planes, and we've already lost a couple of carriers 2 months earlier during the Battle of the Coral Sea, lost another carrier up at Midway. So Fletcher does what he thinks is the prudent thing for the Navy, and he withdraws his carriers. He says, I'm not letting my carriers be part of this. Well, the other ships, now that they don't have airplanes protecting them from above, the captains of the other ships are like, I'm not sticking around here without carrier craft protecting me from above. And the other fleet captains withdraw. What does that mean? Now, you might think nothing. It's the Navy. Who cares? The Marines are doing their thing. Where do you think the Marines are coming from? Where do you think their supplies are coming from? They're coming from ships. Okay? So now the Marines, 11,000 Marines, are on shore on Guadalcanal, and there's no ships protecting them. There's no ships bringing supplies. There's no ships bringing reinforcements. They are stuck on this island alone. All right. And this is a really big deal, and it's kind of a turning point in the battle. At first, everything's going great. And now all of a sudden, we don't have planes protecting us from overhead. We don't have ships providing gunfire offshore. We don't have supplies coming in. We don't have reinforcements coming in. And this is when things start getting dire for the Marines. And this is going to be when Lou Diamond kind of reappears in the Guadalcanal battle. So there in the thick of the battle was Lou Diamond. Lou Diamond was an expert with mortars. And an easy way for us civilians to think about mortars is that they're like little bitty cannons. And these little bitty cannons lob basically grenade type things on a parabolic arc, if you remember that from your geometry class. They're kind of like what we shoot fireworks out of on the 4th of July, but don't shoot fireworks out that way. Using a mortar is trying to be really good at geometry. How far is this thing going to loop up? Where is the parabola going to bring it down? And Lou Diamond was an artist with the mortar. There were legends that Diamond put one straight down a chimney. An even more unbelievable story said that he put one down the smokestack of a Japanese ship at least a quarter mile off of Guadalcanal. I want to believe that's true so bad, but I'm not really sure about the historical evidence. While these stories may or may not be true, there really was an importance to them. Diamond motivated the guys around him. He knew that, as one writer put it, morale is sometimes a do-it-yourself effort. And he gave other Marines confidence in a situation that absolutely had to be terrifying. So, while Diamond and the other Marines are fighting just a valiant effort on shore in Guadalcanal, and the Army is now starting to get there too. There's a couple of Army units that are going to be on the island, as well as 1st Marine Division. Both sides start reinforcing. They start getting reinforcements in. The U.S. is providing reinforcements by air. We're not able to land troops on the shores anymore, but we're bringing guys in by air. The Japanese are bringing guys in at the far west end of the island by ship. Japan is maintaining naval superiority in the north. I think I wrote the north and east here, and what I mean is the north and west. The Japanese are controlling the north and west of the island. The U.S. has air power over the south and east of the island during the day. So at night, when the American planes aren't flying, the Japanese are using these fast destroyers to bring troops and supplies in, but they can't get any heavy equipment in. The Americans are able to bring in troops and supplies during the day, but can't bring any heavy equipment. They can't bring in any cannon. They can't bring in any jeeps or bulldozers or anything like that you would want for fighting in a canal and improving an airstrip. The weather starts to get bad in September. They start getting the rainy season in September. And the fighting slows down again because neither side can move quick because they don't have heavy equipment blowing paths through the jungle. And the Americans, again, kind of get a false sense of security like they did at the beginning of the battle. Like, oh, the Japanese aren't fighting hard. Oh, this is going to be easy. Everything's fine. The quote that I have on the side there, pros talk logistics. This is kind of an old military adage that, if you remember when we talked about strategy and tactics are what lots of people who kind of enjoy military history like talking about. They like talking about the grand strategy. So in this case, in World War II, was tackling Europe first the right strategy? And they can argue all day about that. When it comes to tactics, should America have invaded Normandy 2 years earlier? Was the decision to go to North Africa a mistake? At Normandy, should there have been more aerial targeting of, like, people love talking about the guns on target parts of war. The fact of the matter is, though, throughout the history of warfare, none of your strategy and none of your tactics matter if you can't get guys and weapons to the place. So there's this old saying, amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk about logistics. And logistics is, how are you actually getting your guys there? How are you keeping them supplied? And when we look at the Battle of Guadalcanal, so much of it comes down to logistics. Why do things go swimmingly well in the beginning? Logistics. Why do they go really bad right after that? Also logistics. Okay, then during the rainy season, when we're able to resupply better from the air, we've got flights coming in, we're building up more material. Why are things going well? Logistics. Why are things going to start going badly again? Also logistics. Okay, and you're going to hear me talk a lot about transport ships over the course of this year, and I hope you don't get bored to tears. But transportation and logistics are not just a big part of warfare, they're a big part of everything. When you guys think about it, logistics and supply chain, why did we all run out of toilet paper at the very beginning of the pandemic? Logistics. Why are there Dr. Pepper shortages and stuff? Logistics. Like, so many things that have happened during the entire COVID crisis have come down to logistics. It's not as easy as just throwing ventilators in hospitals. You have to make them. You have to warehouse them. When you keep them in a warehouse, you don't just keep them in a cold, dark room. You check them out and make sure they're still working from time to time. All of those are logistical decisions, and professionals talk about logistics. Anybody can talk about warheads to foreheads. Not everybody can talk about intelligently how do you actually get the stuff there, how do you supply it, how do you make sure it's been built, how do you make sure it's working. Battle of Henderson Field comes about in September. All around that airport that we said was built at Lunga Point. Japan realizes nothing they're doing on Guadalcanal is going to work unless they can take control of that airfield. So the Japanese over on the west end of the island build up a force of like 35,000 soldiers. That's more than, in the American structure, that's more than 2 infantry divisions. They start bombardment from ships offshore on the 1st of October. And they bomb the field for the better part of 3 weeks. On the 24th of October, the Japanese attack the field. And on the very west end of the field, there's a river that goes by there. The Marines hold the line along that river for 2 days. 1,000 Marines hold off an attack by 20,000 Japanese soldiers. One of the guys who becomes a hero out of this is a Marine sergeant named John Basilone, who I believe was from either Philadelphia or New Jersey, or the part of New Jersey close to Philadelphia. I can't remember for sure. But John Basilone commands 2 machine gun positions for 48 straight hours. He loses 60 of his own men. They kill 1,500 Japanese in defending their position. Now, this is the point where I tell you something really important to understand about warfare. Warfare is not a video game. Body count doesn't mean you've won. In lots of wars, one side has almost no losses and the other side has thousands, and the side that lost thousands of guys still won. What's more important in warfare and frankly in life than anything else is, what was the goal that you set for yourself? Did you reach the goal? And in this case, the body count, which I really urge you not to get stuck in thinking body counts are real important, but when it's a mismatch like this, it is something that I'm going to bring up. In this case, Basilone and his incredibly small number of men do manage to hold out against a vastly superior force under incredible conditions. Basilone is later going to be awarded the Medal of Honor. He lives through this. He's going to live to fight another day. He's going to go back to the United States and train other guys, and he's going to come back to the Pacific at the end of the war. With the loss at Henderson Field, Japan switches to defense on the island for the rest of the campaign. The Battle of the Matanikaw is going to follow this as the Americans start pushing over towards the Japanese lines. Battle of the Matanikaw is where we see Lou Diamond show up again with his mortars. And it's where we have a lot of our Toledo guys end up in just almost inhuman circumstances, and suffering with post-traumatic stress disorder after being in these battles for months, losing track of where they are, and really just in circumstances that you and I can't imagine today. This is kind of the topography of that counteroffensive. The Matanikaw battles were down here. This is Lunga Point up here. You see Henderson Field is over here. Those battles along the river with Basilone were over here at the end of Henderson Field. And then the Americans push out from that blue line over to this one. The Japanese try to get forces through repeatedly, trying to take that airfield. In the end of this battle comes at the end of the year. In November, the Japanese are trying to resupply. When you see me use IJA in this class, it's Imperial Japanese Army. IJA is Imperial Japanese Army. IJN is Imperial Japanese Navy. Remember, they did not have unified command. Army did what it wanted. Navy did what it wanted. The Army tries to resupply for another offensive, but the problem is they have no intelligence. They don't have any information coming in, so they don't know how many American forces there are or where they are. And the Americans just keep coming from every direction, and the Japanese aren't able to anticipate the attacks. By the time we get to the 7th of December, precisely 1 year after the Battle of Pearl Harbor, the remaining Japanese troops are on 1/3 rations, which means they're getting 1/3 of a meal per day. They're literally physically wasting away to nothing. By that date, 50 Japanese soldiers were dying every day of malnutrition. Now, if you think about it, okay, those are the 50 that died. Think about the guys who lived. Were they in any kind of shape to be running and fighting and strenuously exerting themselves? Absolutely not. The Japanese, because they couldn't master logistics here, are killing themselves. They're dying through the fact that they can't provide logistical support to their men. On 31st December, Japanese command gives orders to evacuate the island forces to New Guinea. And within the next 2 months, all of the Japanese forces are evacuated from Guadalcanal back to the much bigger island of New Guinea, just north of Australia. What do we learn from this? The Americans, especially the Marines and the Navy, learn that the logistics are the toughest part of island fights. Anytime we invade one of these islands, you better have the logistics train right behind them, and you better not let it get broken. You have to have the replacements, the supplies, the food pouring in from day one, minute one. Air superiority is critical. You've got to have air cover when you're going over these islands. You've got to be able to deny the Japanese the ability to provide air cover. Sounds like I have air cover right now coming in over me. The other thing that we learned on Guadalcanal that's going to be a continuing theme as we move through this class, even while taking incredible, monumental casualties, the Imperial Japanese Army didn't quit. And it was the first time that we saw that in ground battle. It was the first time we saw the tenacity of Japanese forces. Now, those are the lessons the Americans learned. The Imperial Japanese Army learned lessons from Guadalcanal too. And the lesson they learned was the wrong lesson. When they left Guadalcanal, they were ashamed. In Japanese culture, there is a bias against retreat. There is a bias against saving your forces to fight another day, which the rest of us, and including Japanese forces today, would say is smart. Don't leave your guys in a hopeless position where you're going to lose your ability to fight. That's a dumb way to fight a war. Instead, what the Japanese learned at Guadalcanal is we never should have surrendered. We should have fought to the last man. We should have let everybody get killed on that island. We should have kept fighting. Guadalcanal is going to be one of the last Japanese strategic retreats of the war. There is no shame in a strategic retreat. Strategic retreats are saving your guys to be able to fight the enemy again. If you remember the battle at Dunkirk that we talked about in 1940 over in France with the British evacuating all of their guys and a much smaller number of French guys from the beaches at Dunkirk, we look at that as a great triumph. The soldiers were afraid they were going to be made fun of for retreating. They were welcomed home as heroes. You guys made it out. We're still going to be able to fight again. The Japanese didn't look at the retreat from Guadalcanal that way. They looked at those guys as lesser and inferior and shameful. And the Japanese army is never going to make this mistake again. They're going to fight to the last man in every battle. And I put mistake in air quotes there because this is eventually what's going to destroy the Japanese ability to wage war. Let's catch up with Lou Diamond one last time. Diamond got really sick on Guadalcanal. They had to move him around on a cart for a while because he couldn't walk. He was so weakened. And even from the cart, he was directing mortar fire on Japanese positions. The man was 53 years old and in really, really bad shape. They evacuated him to a hospital in New Zealand, and he recovered enough that he ends up bullying the doctors and bullying some officers. into releasing from the hospital. Then he finds his way to a ship, hitchhikes on a ship from one island to another in the Pacific Ocean, tries to rejoin his unit at Guadalcanal. And when he actually makes it 1,000 miles away to Guadalcanal, his unit's gone. So he keeps ship hitchhiking another 1,000 miles to get to Australia, where his unit is now. Eventually, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, the general who's in charge of all the Marines, flies to Australia, awards Diamond this medallion that he is now the ideal Marine and a commendation award, and sends him back to Toledo. And Diamond comes back to Toledo as kind of a hero and a legend. And he's only here for a couple of weeks before they ship him back to the Marine Corps Recruit Depot at Parris Island to train new Marines how to run the mortars. After the war, he comes back to Toledo, and he lives out with his brother on Fryer near Rogers High School. When the Korean War broke out, Lou Diamond was 60 years old, went to downtown Toledo, tried to enlist again to fight in his third war, and the Marine Corps politely told him no. And within a year, Lou Diamond was dead. His legacy lives on among Marines today as the 200-year-old Marine and the hero of Guadalcanal, and the namesake of Toledo's Marine Corps detachment. All right, guys, thanks for watching. And as always, even with all of this, you're doing great.